A reading from St. Matthew's Gospel. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. "What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes are in kings' palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I tell you, among those born of woman, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." What a mess the world is in today. Wherever we look, we see selfishness, destruction of others, lies, hatred, starvation, torture, and every other evil we can think of. There is a lack of trust everywhere. Never has the peace of God, the love of God for everybody, been so badly needed and so sadly rejected. In our reading today, we heard of Jesus talking about John the Baptist. John's work was done. He had foretold the coming of the Messiah, the special one, who would lead the Jews back to God. He had preached not a gospel of love, but the possibility of damnation, of hellfire, if people did not turn from their present lives, confess their sins, and were penitent. He was a man who was totally loyal to his calling, and no doubt upset many of the Jewish hierarchy. Most certainly he had upset Herod by his condemnation of Herod's private life, and paid for this condemnation by his imprisonment. Jesus was visited by some of John's disciples. Jesus took the opportunity to see how well John's work had been received. He was asking how people saw John the Baptist. There is no doubt that John was perceived as an unusual man. People, softened by town living, would not have poured out into the desert to listen to this man of the wilderness, who lived by eating insects and wild honey, who was dressed in animal skins, and who had such a powerful presence that people allowed themselves to be baptized by him with a baptism of absolution. Jesus was questioning how John had been perceived. He asked if people went out to see a reed blown by the wind, an everyday expression in Aramaic to describe a very ordinary or spineless person. They did not go out to see someone who was comfortable in high living, with grand clothes and luxurious living, someone who was comfortable in high society. We know this because we hear that John was not afraid to tell the truth, regardless of how high-born the person he was criticizing was. Why did they go out into the desert? Did they go out to see a prophet? Amos suggests that God does nothing without revealing it through his prophets. A prophet is a man with a message from God, a man who has the courage to deliver it. Another definition of a prophet is that he is a man with God's wisdom in his mind, God's truth on his lips, and God's courage in his heart. Surely such a man was John. But in reality, John was more than a prophet. It was a general belief that before the Messiah came, Elijah would return to herald his coming. Jesus, though in our reading states that John was divine herald, and no one could have a greater task than that, we are told that in the heavenly hierarchy he was nothing. The great truth is that Jesus brought into the world something which was totally new. The prophets were great men. Their message was precious. But with Jesus there was something greater still, a message that was even more marvellous. But what was that thing that John lacked? What was it that the Christian has that John could not have? Very simply, he did not have knowledge of the cross. Without this knowledge, he could not see the full revelation of the love of God. The holiness of God he might have known, the justice of God he might have taught, but the love of God in all its fullness he could never know. John's message was not a gospel, a declaration of good news, but it was a threat of damnation, of destruction. It takes Jesus and the cross to show the length, the depth, and the breadth of God's love for each and every one of us. So John's destiny was to point out men a greatness into which he could never enter. God needed John. God needed the signpost of John to point out the way to God for men, although John himself could never reach that ultimate goal. But to return to our reading, the disciples of John, who was imprisoned, had come to Jesus with a simple question. Was Jesus indeed the Messiah, or was there someone else yet to come? We do not know whether this doubt came from John himself, or were John's own disciples raised the question, and so John sent them to find out for themselves who Jesus was. There may have been a certain degree of impatience behind this question. The Messiah was expected to be an all-powerful, conquering king who would lead the Jews to be a world power. Jesus was doing nothing of the sort. Let us remember the person who expects savage wrath from Jesus will always be disappointed, but the person who looks for love will never find his hopes dashed. There may have been a certain degree of faith and hope. John was in prison, and no doubt pretty sure that his release would be his death. All that John was looking for was confirmation that his hope, his trust, had not been misplaced. Jesus' answer to John must have been a great comfort, as indeed it should be to each and every one of us. Jesus did not respond with a lengthy argument. He did not use words, prophecies, or any other claims to reply. He simply said, "Don't worry about what I say. Look at what I do." Here Jesus was asking that the strictest test should be applied to him, that of deeds. Jesus can rightly be judged not by what he said, but by what he did. He is still saying to us, "Look what I can do for you. See what I have done for others." The things that Jesus did in Galilee, he still does today. In him, those who are blind to the truth about themselves, about their fellow men, and about God have their eyes opened. In him, those who were not strong enough to walk in God's way are strengthened. In him, those who are tainted with the disease of sin are cleansed. In him, those who are deaf to the voice of their conscience and of God are able to listen. In him, those who were dead and powerless in sin are raised to the newness and loveliness of life. In him, the poorest person inherits the riches of the love of God. In this passage, we also hear a warning. Blessed are those who take no offence at me. This was said to John, but it was said because John had only grasped half the truth. John preached of divine holiness with divine destruction. Jesus preached of divine holiness with divine love. Here is the message for each and every one of us. Maybe what is happening is not what we expect from God, but the powers of evil are being destroyed, not by irresistible power, but by unanswerable love. Are there ideals of a life in Jesus falling flat because those ideals are our ideals and not those of God? That is our challenge. We have the ability to find this complete love bought for us by the cross if we will look for it. That is what we should be doing today and every day. Put aside our own wants and embrace that special gift which can only come from God through Jesus Christ. Amen.